Whose streets? Our streets! Say it loud, say it clear! Welcome here, so welcome here! Whose streets? Our streets! Whose arena? Our arena! Whose arena? Our arena! Whose arena?
Well, we shouldn't have to be here today, but the council have allowed Franklin Graham, a hateful preacher who hates LGBT people, hates Islamic people, hates women's rights, is basically being allowed to preach in our council-owned building.
Streets! Our streets! Whose arena? Our arena! Whose arena? Our arena! Say it loud! Say it clear! Franklin Graham, so welcome here! Say it loud!
We are not a city built on hate, we are a city built on love. There's a massive growth in the far right. The far right are the biggest terror threat in the UK, have been for many, many years, yet we still look at diverse communities as if they are the threat. We still look at the Muslim community as if they are the threat.
The attacks on members of the LGBT, even in our city, have increased in the last 12 months. So why on earth would you not do everything you can to stop this man from spreading division in our city?
Homophobic and transphobic hate crimes have more than quadrupled over the last 5 years, and in Liverpool there was a big spike in reported hate crimes, at least reported ones anyway, that were quite prominent.
Reclaim Pride's idea is that the money for the queer community in Liverpool should be properly distributed with education and community involvement, rather than what is happening with all the money in the queer community right now, which is going towards photo opportunities with the police and paying the council to block the roads off for a protest. So yeah, we started Reclaim Pride to try and actually help the queer community in Liverpool with any money that we get.
Good afternoon. Welcome back to the discussions this afternoon. The clip that you've just seen on Reclaim Pride is the work of Haz and this comrade here, Phil Maxwell, and it's sort of an introduction to our discussion this afternoon on the struggle to reclaim pride, the struggle for LGBT plus rights. And we've got three speakers going to talk about both their own personal experiences and something of the history of that struggle. I'll let them introduce themselves because they all come from different parts of that struggle, had different experiences, and that's probably the best way to do it. Down the line from London, I've always wanted to say that, Teddy, sounds very professional, but down the line from London we've got Teddy Brown. Teddy will be ending the discussion or this conversation. We've got Joan Burnett in Liverpool, involved in Homotopia. And then we've got Phil Maxwell, who made the film. So we'll kick off with Phil, and then we'll move on to our other two speakers. And we've got about an hour or so, so we'll intersperse it with questions and comments, as necessary. Okay, so take it away, Phil.
Well, first of all, Kevin, can I say I'm a bit disappointed that I'm sitting next to you on the couch and I'm not wearing a cravat. I feel underdressed. But in terms of the introduction of myself, I'm an artist and filmmaker, but most importantly, a trade unionist and an activist with the Merseyside Pensioners Association, an organisation which you are a proud member of too.
Yeah. So, Phil, could you just tell us something about the history of Pride, but in particular its importance in terms of the struggle for gay rights?
Well, I think the first Pride demonstration was in 1972, something like that. I may have got the date slightly wrong. The first Pride that I went on was in the very late 70s. I think it was about 1979. And of course, in those days, Pride wasn't a kind of celebration as it is today, and a very consumer-orientated commercial event. It was a protest. And the reason Pride was a protest is because LGBT plus people were basically being oppressed. They were losing their jobs, they were being victimised by the police, they were subjected to homophobic attacks, and we're now living in the UK when homophobic attacks are actually going. In fact, I believe that anti-LGBT attacks in the last 5 years have quadrupled. So something is clearly going wrong. And why we talk about reclaiming Pride is because it's become very commercialised, and the big business people have taken over. The police march with people on Pride, and a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about this because Pride is essentially a protest to make people aware that homophobia is not acceptable in any form, transphobia is not acceptable in any form, and we don't agree with this kind of pinkwashing, which means that, you know, Tesco's, Sainsbury's, banks and the police can piggyback on the community with their own agenda.
Could I just go back a little bit from 72 and maybe remind viewers about both the legal and I suppose the cultural and the social position of, you know, what were widely known then as homosexuals, homosexual law reform, something I remember being discussed when I was a teenager, and in particular the sort of culture and maybe the public feeling and maybe you know the sort of the struggles were both political and social as well as just purely in terms of protest.
Well, of course, it's a myth that when the 1967 Act, which supposedly decriminalised homosexuality, solved everything. In fact, if you look at the statistics, after 1967, more, in particular, gay men were arrested, and the police went out of their way to arrest gay people. So the actual number of people who were charged and imprisoned went up after that particular act. And of course, you were only legal if you were a practicing homosexual, if you were doing it behind closed doors. So, I mean, it's really quite absurd. But that was a step in the right direction, and there have been lots of bits of legislation since then. But all of these legislative initiatives around reforms around sexuality have only come about because of the community and their friends campaigning against attacks, against homophobia, and campaigning for LGBT rights. It's always Parliament that is the last to receive the message, and it is with some reluctance that these laws are passed. And of course, if you go back to the I don't remember the 60s that well, but strangely enough, I do remember it coming on the television about the 67 Act. I think I must have been about 14 or 15 at the time. And I remember my mother and father looking at each other as if something horrendous had happened, that this evil was going to be allowed in society. So I was acutely aware as a teenager that there was something apparently wrong with me because I had an attraction to my own sex. So homophobia in the 60s and the 70s was rampant, and I went to a teacher training college in Liverpool, which is now Hope University, and I studied theology. And I got very, very annoyed when the Pope issued an encyclical. I think it was Humane Vitae, and he said that if you were homosexual, you were intrinsically disordered. And I was very much involved in the student union at the time, so we decided to have a debate. And I characterised the Pope as someone who was intrinsically disordered. And that didn't do my career in Catholic education a great deal of good, to be honest. And like many people of my generation who were LGBT, who started a career in teaching, we left because it was a hostile environment. You know, you had to be secretive about your sexuality. Colleagues knew I was gay, but it was a very difficult environment to operate in. And in the 80s, it got worse with the AIDS epidemic, where you had newspapers like the Scum newspaper, which fortunately isn't read in this city, although Keir Starmer does write for that paper, and I think that tells you a lot about Keir Starmer. The homophobia that existed at that time was dreadful, and the attacks on LGBT people increased. So I'm a member in Liverpool of LGBT plus Reclaim Pride, and it's been very important that that's been resurrected in Liverpool, because as we saw in the film, the Liverpool City Council actually, after they decided it would be a good thing to have an arms fair in a council building, which was organised by a company owned by the council, they then agreed it would be okay for Franklin Graham, who's an evangelical preacher, who's misogynist and he's homophobic. It would be okay for him to come to the city as well. So the people in that film you saw, and it was very refreshing to see so many young people involved in that demonstration, they were protesting against this kind of institutionalised homophobia, which the Liverpool City Council, a Labour council, had allowed to happen. And they were saying, oh, it's going to be all right because he's given us assurances that he's not going to attack the gay community. And of course, those assurances were worth nothing, because what actually happened is that the BBC, that bastion of journalistic impartiality, interviewed Franklin Graham on the waterfront in Liverpool, and he just told everybody in the UK, no, sorry, not everybody in the UK, because the BBC broadcast it on their international news service. He told everybody that homosexuals were sinful. And of course, when you've got people saying these things, it has a direct impact on the LGBT community. And that is evidenced by the crimes and attacks against LGBT people. So that's why we got on the streets, and that's why when we had the Pride March in Liverpool, we were very visible under our Reclaim Pride banner, because we have to reclaim Pride and take it back as a protest, because we have to be vigilant continuously to ensure that homophobia, any kind of oppression of minorities, is not allowed to flourish in society. And we can't sit back and wait for politicians to do this for us, because politicians only listen when the grassroots communities get up and start making demands. So we are demanding in Liverpool that we oppose this homophobia, and we attacked, and people criticised us for it, the local authority, for allowing the Franklin Graham jamboree to happen in a council-owned building. And the mayor of Liverpool actually, shortly before that, she criticised the LGBT community for not reporting every crime to the police. Well, understandably, a lot of LGBT people are dubious about reporting hate crime because they've probably witnessed in their own experience discrimination themselves from the police. I mean, I certainly remember when I used to go to gay clubs in Liverpool that it was very likely that as you came out you could be stopped, or indeed when you were in there in the club having a drink, the club could be raided. So,
which period are we talking about there, Phil?
well, that's in the 1970s.
Right.
So obviously it's different now, but it's people do report harassment, and sometimes they blame themselves. And the mayor criticised people for not reporting. Well, one of the reasons people don't report is because they've got little faith in the police, and they don't like the police marching on these pride marches, understandably.
Just going back a little bit, because again, I'm interested to make the comparison with your activism in the 70s and 80s and today. You were a Labour councillor, and you were quite active in Labour Party politics in East London, I think. How important were these issues in Labour politics? What were you doing to sort of raise these questions, both in the Labour Party and when you were a councillor? And what sort of difficulties did you face?
That's a very interesting question. I'm going back now to the 1980s. So I was a opposition councillor when we had a Liberal administration.
That was in Tower Hamlets?
In Tower Hamlets. I was first elected in 1986. Now, I've never really considered myself to be a gay activist. I've always considered myself to be a socialist and active shop steward, trade union member, whatever. But I suppose in a sense, I am a gay activist insofar as whenever I've come across prejudice, homophobia, I've always opposed it. And it's interesting you should ask me about the Labour Party because for a time I was leader of the opposition on the council. Obviously I never became leader because, you know, I opposed the poll tax and I supported the Can't Pay, Won't Pay campaign. So I was safe when I was in opposition. But when I first went into the council chamber, I was very much aware that the leader of the council, Liberal, was gay. His partner, who was the mayor, was gay, but it was all kind of secretive. And I never attempted to out them, but everybody knew that I was gay, so I made no secret about it. So, but I knew at the time in the Labour Party a vast number of LGBT people who were deeply in the closet if they were involved in Labour Party politics. And of course there were numerous MPs, still are, who never came out. And that was maybe a little bit uncomfortable. But it wasn't the Labour Party that brought about this great transformation in terms of LGBT rights. It was the grassroots. And indeed, my partner of 25 years, who was from Malaysia, the government under Tony Blair tried to throw him out of the country. He was stopped when I went to meet him after he went back to see his family at Heathrow. And we had to have a big campaign to stop him being thrown out. And I went to all the MPs that I knew, explained the situation, and they said, oh, don't worry, we're going to change the law and all the rest of it. But and they could have stopped him being thrown out. And this has happened to a lot of people. And eventually we went to the High Court and we won the case. So the person who you mentioned earlier, Hasban Hashim, my partner, no thanks to Tony Blair and Jack Straw, was able to make that film. So I'm a bit cynical about politicians who say that they're all in favour of LGBT rights, but really don't back the community up as much as they should do.
Thanks, Phil. You've given some sort of historical context and political context. What I'd like to do now is to call in Joan Burnett from Homotopia. I wonder, Joan, if you could perhaps explain something about Homotopia and also about the current campaigns and the current situation in Liverpool.
I can, and I'd like to say that I'm actually speaking on my own behalf today.
That's fine. Yeah.
I am a board member of Homotopia, but and I'm very proud to be part of that. But my relevance, I think, for today is that I helped run Liverpool Pride from 2010 to 2018. I'm not part of the team that runs Liverpool City Region Pride, which is the Pride that happens now. I do volunteer for it. So I just want to make that really clear at the beginning. I'm not speaking on behalf of Homotopia, much as they are wonderful. So the scene here in Liverpool is Homotopia, is Liverpool's LGBT plus queer arts festival. It's funded as part of the Arts Council's national portfolio. And I think it's the only LGBTQ festival that is funded in that way, but that might have changed. It was a couple of years ago. And what Homotopia do is produce a brilliant festival of work, which will be coming up in November, but it also supports young people, emerging artists, and it's a campaigning organisation on behalf of LGBTQ people. For people who don't know Liverpool, our local pride is Liverpool City Region Pride, and it's called that because it embraces the whole of our region, which is 6 different boroughs. And very important in our region that we don't forget that Liverpool, much as it is the jewel in the crown, is not the only part of the crown. There's lots of wonderful boroughs in our area that also need to be represented. I'm very proud that Reclaim Pride happens in Liverpool. I think it's the most wonderful group of people. When I see the work that Reclaim Pride do, I feel as though the future is safe. Some of the young people that I talk to who are part of that, I think, are extremely talented, clever, articulate, powerful people. They come from all kinds of different backgrounds and they have a lot to offer. I think Reclaim Pride, but also our city as a whole and beyond. Actually, I think the UK as a whole, there's extraordinary people involved in that movement. I suppose I'm a bit of a sitter on the fence. I'm a past Pride organiser, and I hold my hand up and say I was part of the team that brought in corporate sponsorship for that event. I'm not ashamed of that. And I can explain why. I also understand why people see it as problematic. What I would say about Liverpool Pride and its successor, Liverpool City Region Pride, is that they're not commercial organisations. So they don't run for profit. Liverpool Pride certainly didn't. If we'd have made a profit, we'd have had a... Well, it would have been amazing. We ran very much as a campaign, and Liverpool City Region still runs as a campaign. I want to correct something that's in the film that isn't true. Pride doesn't pay the police. The police are not paid to police on the day of Pride. They're not paid to police the march. The people who are paid for the march are the people who close off the roads and clean up after it. And that's very important to make that distinction. The police did march at Liverpool Pride and do march in the current Pride. I understand why that's problematic, and I think that's an ongoing conversation. I understand the complexities of that. I would also say that there are LGBTQ people within the police who are trying to effect change. I'm not saying that's a pink wash. Pride for the police. Do you understand? I do understand why it's problematic and why people feel very passionately about that. In terms of corporate sponsorship, what happens is there isn't public money to put on these events. It isn't a bottomless pit of money. And people say, well, why do you have to have a huge pride? Well, the people make the pride. We used to make this very clear at Liverpool Pride that we were just the organising committee. We don't make pride. The people who turn up on the day make pride. And in Liverpool, the march is 12,000 people. That is huge. The event itself, the last one that I was involved in, I was told by the authorities that over 50,000 people attended that. It's huge. They come because they want to come. We can argue that maybe it's not needed. I think it is. I think all kinds of people come to prides, not all of them LGBTQ. Back in the day when we produced those surveys, we find out that about half of the people who attend are not LGBTQ, but they are our allies. I call them the people who line the street to watch the march, the people who come who aren't LGBT. I call them the silent majority. They're the straight people, if you want to use that word, the heterosexual people who aren't homophobic and aren't transphobic or don't want to be. They want to affect change within themselves. I think that's a really important voice. And having that huge event that brings the city to a halt is a huge sign. It's an important sign. I know lots of people who have said to me over the years, it just lifts me that I can see that many people turn out in our support. I've also had people be very, very critical. And what I would say to any Pride organiser is involve your critics. Involve them, talk to them. They have valid points of view. I absolutely understand that Pride can now could be seen as a commercial movement, but each Pride is very different. So there are over 150 Prides in the UK. You could say that that's ridiculous. Why do we need 150 prides? You could also say that's every single one of 150 communities saying, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to have a point of view, and we want to stop our police. We want to make it happen. I went to New Brighton Pride this summer. I'm from New Brighton. That's my hometown. That's where I was born and brought up, although I've lived in Liverpool a very long time. I cried my eyes out to see a Pride happen in New Brighton. It was small, it was grassroots. It was great. Wasn't perfect, they never are, but it was absolutely, I never thought I'd see that in that very white working class community, it's very traditional community, it was amazing to see that. So that's where I stand on Prides. I absolutely want Prides not to be commercial gigs. I think some of the very big Prides have turned into that. You buy your ticket for Pride and you go to a gig. That's a gig to me. But LCR Pride is not that. You can just turn up whoever you are and go to it.
Joan.
I don't know if it's
Yeah.
Are you sick of me yet?
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's the communications are great between London and Liverpool, but not within the city, I think. I'm just interested in when you began. You said there was a debate, within Pride, and indeed the wider community about this direction. And you said you were sitting on the fence and so on. I'm just interested really about the nature of that debate and whether you could sort of classify it in any way. All sorts of movements, particularly those which are born out of protest and struggle, often go through a sort of life cycle, and there's often arguments that they've been incorporated, that they've been made safe or sanitized or whatever. Was that the sort of nature of the discussion, or did it take another form? So I'm quite interested in that sort of debate, and maybe how you, as one of the organisers, was trying to balance those different tensions, and maybe how you might see it yourself.
I think it's really important that Pride stay free. I think everybody should be able to go. I don't think you should buy a ticket for a Pride. it makes me feel sick, to be honest. And I think the pressures are there to make prides into business. I'm very proud of LCR Pride and the work they do. It's still in its infancy. It's only, it's had a pandemic. It's had a terrible time since they set up. I'm very proud of them. The debates that always used to happen with us, and literally, as one of those organisers, the little group of us from 2010 onwards, that we're not the first Pride in Liverpool, by the way. There were Prides in the 90s, Prides in the 80s, run in different ways. We're only standing on the shoulders of giants there. But we used to get a lot of stick from all kinds of directions. People who thought we weren't commercially enough, people who thought we were far, why are you taking authorities' money? Why are you doing this? People who just thought it was going to be crap. I always remember the first year, even one of my own friends said, it's just going to be rubbish. Why are you getting involved? It'll just be crap. And it wasn't. It was amazing. 21,000 people went to that first Pride because it was needed. There hadn't been one for 15 years. People needed it. So the debate is always there, isn't it? What do you do about it? Once it gets big, once you get 20,000 people at an event, even before that, you've got an absolute duty to keep them safe and well. If you have any, I work in a public building for my daily work. I look after the public every day of my working life, and it's behoving on us to keep everybody safe and well at all times. So you have to put in place that structure to do that, and you need to raise money to do that. People don't donate. You can try and get donations out of people. It's really, really hard work to get enough money to do that. Some people were saying, well, why don't you ticket it and just make it into a gig? There's quite a large amount of people in Liverpool who wanted that. They wanted to be Liverpool's equivalent of Manchester or Brighton. But we didn't want that. And in fact, just thinking back to those first set-up days with Tommy McElravy and the team, they came up with some great values: to be visible, to be inclusive, to be free, and to be uniquely Liverpool. To have Liverpool content on the stages, to have Liverpool people running it. And when I say Liverpool, sorry, other regions, I mean all of you really. For it to be something that didn't look like everywhere else, that was absolutely unique. And I'd say that's true to this day. If people went this year to the stage on the Pierhead, it was extraordinary. Young Homotopia were on the stage, a group called Many Hands, One Heart, which comprises people who are seeking asylum in the country, were on the main stage. It was absolutely extraordinary. And okay, there were the big headliners too, but I thought it was a great mix, really, of the local and the headliner. To me, the local people were the headliners. They were absolutely extraordinary content. But the debate is always there. For me, it's not a debate. I want Pride to be open, accessible, safe. Sometimes people don't. It means that they think that's sanitised. I don't see Liverpool Pride sanitised. I always remember the year when the protesters ran up. Every year we have Christian protesters who say we're sinful and hold up banners. And every year something, the march, they're usually they don't interrupt the march, but they're always there counter protesting. And I always remember the year the Liverpool anarchists ran over with a massive banner that said fisting across the Mersey and set up loads of flares behind them so that the Christian contingent, that particular contingent, there were lots of pro-LGBT Christians, looked as though they were in the fiery pit of hell. It was very funny, and it certainly wasn't sanitised. So I think a Pride like Liverpool is the best balance. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think they do a good job of balancing the right to protest, which it is. Anyone can march. You don't pay to come in our march. There are no barriers. What happens is the march is always longer at the end than at the beginning because the people watching come and join it, which is always an extraordinary thing to witness. I think that's great. I think it needs to guard that it never becomes a fenced-off gig. But then it's not Pride for me.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Joan. That was a very, useful background to the situation in Liverpool. For the last contribution, I'd like to bring in Teddy Brown, and Teddy can both explain about his own background and also about his own campaigning activity over a few years or so.
Oh, hello. Yes. Right. Okay. So I was one of the participants in that very first Pride March in 1972, along with my partner, who had come from Portsmouth, where he was a student. We were together for 50 years. He died last December. And there's a whole story around that, the way that he was treated in the 2 care homes that he went into after he got dementia. But I think I'd like to give a little bit of a background to the original first Prides. Many people probably have already heard about this, but the initial start of the modern LGBT movement began at the Stonewall Bar in New York on the 28th of June 1969, when the police began one of their customary raids against the customers in the pub, in the bar, and they fought back. At one point, apparently, they were being particularly abusive to a lesbian that they were dragging into a police car. And she turned to the crowd and said, "Why are you all just standing there?" And someone threw a brick. Someone else shouted "gay power." And the whole thing started and apparently went on for 3 or 4 days. Each evening there was demonstrating and rioting, and people left work and joined in the demonstrations each evening outside that pub. And in fact, there is an account given by the police officer who led that that raid, in which he claims, having been in Vietnam himself, that the way that the people behaved was more terrifying than the experiences that he had had when he was fighting in the United States. Now, the follow-up to that, I mean, I hope I won't take too long on this, because I think it's really important for people to understand the intersectionality of what actually happened. Because there were 2 students from England, Bob Millers and Aubrey Walters, who were around New York at the time, and they heard about what was happening. And they were invited by Huey P. Newton, who was the commander of the Black Panthers, to attend a conference called the People's Convention, People's Revolutionary Convention, which was set up to reword the American Constitution to take into consideration the many people that the Constitution ignored: the Native Americans, women's rights, because when the Constitution was written, women weren't even allowed to vote. So they attended this conference, at which Huey Newton pointed out that lesbians and gay men could be as revolutionary, or possibly even more revolutionary, than many Black people, because of the experiences that they were suffering following racism and slavery. Now, those 2 students, Bob Millers and Aubrey Walters, came back to London to the LSE, the London School of Economics, where they were both students, and launched the very first meeting in the basement in the LSE on the 13th of October, 1970. And 19 people attended. 18 of them were women. 18 of them were men, and there was only one woman, Dora. I've got her name somewhere. I can dig it up if you want. And then apparently the meetings snowballed. They were weekly, and within 6 weeks, they were so full that they actually had to find another location. They moved initially to Covent Garden, to a place called Middle Earth, which is underground. It was where there had been some discos, and they are actually considering having a blue plaque in Covent Garden to commemorate those initial marches. The first public action by the Gay Liberation Front, who organized these first marches, was in the first meeting was in October. By the middle of November, they had demonstrated at Highbury Fields in protest against Pretty Police arrests of gay men who were cruising. That was the very first march, and significantly, almost 50% of the people demonstrating and protesting against the police abuse were women. Even though none of the laws against homosexuality applied against women, and many of the people supporting the demonstration were lesbians, who also were not illegal, but they were experiencing prejudice and discrimination as well. The following year, in 1971, GLF held the Youth Group March in August 1971, which was a protest against the unequal age of consent laws. Because, as you pointed out already, in 1967, homosexuality for men was partially decriminalized, right? You could have sex in private if both participants were over the age of 21. But at the time, the age of consent for heterosexuals was 16. So gay men had to wait a further 5 years before they could do that radical touch that we all want and that we all need: somebody to love, someone to hold, someone to care about, right? Now, let's see. And that was so successful. I was also on that march, and I have pictures of us marching from Hyde Park to Trafalgar Square, where we risked serious imprisonment by kissing each other in public. Again, I have photographs of that, which was really risky because you could get a penalty of 7 years in prison minimum for breaking that age of consent laws. And at the time, I was under the age of consent. So that march went so successfully that we decided that we would have a march, a gay pride march, on the 1st of July, 1972. And we met from 5 different points in London. I joined the group that met in Notting Hill Gate, where people from the Mangrove, the black community from the Mangrove, provided music and food and all sorts of support for us as we marched, countering the rumors that have followed ever since that the black community is more homophobic than the white community, right? So it's very important for people to realize the issue of intersectionality was a matter of importance back in 1970, early 70, 50 years ago. Now, I want to point out, too, that anyone who is interested in the history of this should have a look at this book, which is called No Bath, But Plenty of Bubbles, by Lisa Power. And it's an oral history where she interviewed people like me who had been involved in that march. And it's got this unusual title because the GLF set up 5 communes around London, one of which the Notting Hill Fairies were squatting in a building which had the water turned off, And so they would come to some of the other communes to do their washing, to have baths and so on and so forth. And we would sometimes contact them and ask them, how are they managing to live in a building which has no water supply? And they said, well, we have no bath, but plenty of bubbles because we're all camping it up like crazy and having a wonderful time. That's where the title of the book comes from. So we move on. The first Pride marches, we operated them for more than 10 years, and they were labeled as protests and as marches. Under those circumstances, you don't have to pay. The police are obliged to accompany you. Here's some of my personal photographs of us in Trafalgar Square. There's little me.
Fabulous.
At the end of March. Here's a woman, Carla Lane, who came to the march on the underground wearing this T-shirt, knowing that nobody else on that train had ever seen an open lesbian in public. This was a really courageous move on her part. And she gave an amazing speech about being a woman, about being lesbian, and about being in a mixed race relationship. Unfortunately, nobody recorded any of the speeches at that great event in 1972.
Teddy Brown.
Sorry, am I running over time or something?
No, it's fine. No, we've about another 10 minutes or so, Teddy. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, so we ran the marches. The police were, because they were designated as protests and as marches, we didn't have to pay. The numbers of people joining began to grow from the initial 2,000, we estimate, of that very first march, to around 35,000 by the time we got to 1988. And it was then, following the initiation of Section 28 in 1988, that the march trebled. They reckon there was more than 100,000 people who turned up to protest against this vile backward step by the Tory government, which denied the right for any local authority or educational authority to do anything which could be considered as promoting homosexuality or enabling homosexual relationships as a pretend family. Right? It was then that it became necessary, or some people considered it necessary, for the marches to take a different tone, to become more celebratory rather than a protest. And under those circumstances, you do have to pay. If you're labeling your march as a festival or as a carnival, then you pay to support for the police. And things got really out of hand in 2013, when the charge for attending Trafalgar Square was £100,000, plus you had to pay £67,000 to Westminster Council to compensate them for the loss of parking fines in the area, plus other expenses. And then things snowballed. We wound up having Pepsi Cola, Marks and Spencer's, all these commercial organizations jumping on the bandwagon. And even one particular group that caused a lot of problems was BAE Systems, who are a military organization providing military weapons and software, which at that time was being used to kill people in Iran and Iraq and Palestine and Israel. So since then, it's moved on. It's become very, very popular. We have now, recently, the Royal Mail has issued a coin celebrating Pride. This is the plain one. There is the rainbow version, which is full color. They're called brilliant uncirculated. They are not permitted to be used as tender, but they're 50p coins. One costs £10, the other costs £18. The Royal Mint are issuing 5 million of these. And it'll be very, very profitable for them. They issued it celebrating those first marches without contacting the Gay Liberation Front, which had been revived in 2016. And they used photographs of us on a previous demonstration, again, without our permission or even knowledge. That's me in the corner here, in my multicolored T-shirt with the Fist of Pride, celebrating being on the first march. And we are actually in discussion and correspondence with Pride to ask them to make sure that the £40,000 that they are contributing to Pride in London some of that money come to the Gay Liberation Front to support our continuing work in helping LGBT people, particularly those who are elderly, who are going into care homes, and particularly for those supporting trans people who from day one experience the worst abuse you can imagine once they go into homes. We all are going to get older. We all are going to need care. And at the moment, none of the care homes provide adequate facilities for us. Now, we want to reclaim Pride for it to become, once again, a movement where we celebrate our existence, but also follow the tradition that we used to have on these marches, which is at the end of the march, there were a number of different locations at which people in cinemas, theaters, parks, and so on, people would gather to hear us give accounts of what it meant to be LGBT, the experiences and the joys that we were having, the opposition and the prejudices that we face. Because currently what happens when this celebrates that in 2019, 1.5 million people came to London to celebrate that march, what happens is they get entertained, they watch us running up and down in drag, having a wonderful time, and then they go home and think everything is all right. It isn't. There's still stuff that needs to be done, and we want to reclaim Pride to be what it initially was and should remain, which is a celebration of who we are and a protest against those forces of darkness that want to push us back into the closet. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Teddy.
Yeah.
I'm standing on my tongue now, I thought.
Thanks very much, Teddy. Thanks very much, Joan. And thanks very much, Phil, as well. Before our next session, which is an update from Stella Assange and Deepa Driver and other comrades who've been involved in the Julian Assange campaign, we're going to have a short film clip. And I think it's not been selected accidentally. It's not about gay pride, but it's actually about another type of movement that was developing in the early 1970s that was filmed. And it's the rent strikes that occurred, all over the country, but there was a fairly big one in Kirby here on Merseyside. And the film is by Nick Broomfield, and it's called Behind the Rent Strike. And it shows the sort of struggles that were going on then in many working class communities. And it shows the sort of struggle and I suppose the sort of politics that we need to reclaim. So reclaim pride, reclaim protest and reclaim working class struggle and working class politics.